Um, so a lot of the soil is made up of loess deposits. If you saw that word in this chapter, loess deposits, which means stuff that's basically blown off the deserts, right? So now if you picture wind on a desert, right? Probably seen plenty of films and things where there's wind on a desert. That's how sand dunes are formed through that wind. Well, as this wind makes its way all the way over here, by the time the particles that is brought over here get there, the heavier bits of sand and whatnot have all kind of stopped moving about here. By the time the particles get over here, they're kind of like dust, like really, really fine materials. And that's what the soils in a lot of this area are made of. I've talked to you before about how rivers naturally change their courses through time, right? Rivers have a tendency to meander because what happens is, well, they carry sediment, and then there'll be an area where maybe the sediment drops off, and it will kind of create a dam and block itself, and so then the river will jump and change course. And so this river here, you can see the current day path, but it's had a lot of different courses through time, and very often you'll have different little villages or sometimes entire civilizations that were based on previous paths of the river, but when the river changes course, well, then you have a whole new scenario. And because the deposits here are this very, very fine loess deposits, like I said, it's fertile soil, so you have plenty of growing, but it's really easy for this to change itself, to have deposits that make it so that it has to change course. And so it does it a lot. It's an example of the book of basically the loess deposits, very easily eroded, right? So if you have an area that is agricultural, if you don't manage it very well, it can easily be eroded and washed away. Because again, it's at very fine particles, smaller than sand. You could just think of it more of like if you had a soil that was completely made up of dust particles, right? How small those would be. Well, this is basically saying the stuff that I just said. Let's see if there's anything I missed. Not really, okay. And these particles in the water actually make for good nutrients for plenty of rice, plenty of fishing, plenty of things like this. But again, they change around through time where they come out over there. What else can we say? We've talked a lot about dams through time in this class. A lot of the dams that originally were put in this region were to try to stabilize the river and where it changes, because again, that could really disrupt your whole system, change where your people can be located, change where water resources are going. This was the same emperor that built a lot of stuff, right? Built the Great Wall, built the Terracotta Warriors. Has anyone been to China in this class? Been to China? Usually got a couple now.
Have you?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. I will actually take y'all on a little journey to give you a sense of place. Looking at a lot of different things. One being the Great Wall of China, which this is the picture from the book. It's a decent picture. Great Wall of China. Well, I'm going to show you basically a hike. Actually, let me go back one slide. Most areas of the Great Wall of China that tourists go to have been reconstructed. And so you'll feel like you're going to this is a real historical place. It's in all the history books. But the places that the tours will have you go to, and they'll often be using the same original bricks. But you have to remember, this wall fell, right? People use an example of this, this walls can stay up forever. It's like, no, this wall fell. Armies came through here many times, right? Mongolia came through here. That was the main enemy that it was built for. So if you want to get out to the original wall that is still hasn't been rebuilt, you gotta hike. You gotta hike and hike and hike, which I did because I'm crazy. This is the place we stayed that was right at like the main tourist area. Very kind of traditional housing structure.
Was that?
What's that?
How long was that?
How long ago?
No. How long did it take you?
Oh, it was like half a day. Yeah, the half a day hike. Which, you know, isn't that long. People hike for like months. People go on crazy long hikes. So mine was sane compared to that, in my opinion. Now this is our group that we were going. Right, we're walking. And there was a lot of locals that were walking with us that at the time thought were other tourists. Also right by the entrance for the Great Wall, they had this kind of amusement park stuff all set up. It was kind of interesting because they really had in mind that people were going to come to the Great Wall and they would also want to go on these rides. I don't know if you could see. These are little cars that you would sit on and it would go like that, you know. None of us really wanted to do it. Go-kart racing right at the Great Wall. They had all this stuff that they really thought tourists would just want to do. But really, if you're going to the Great Wall, you're going there to like go to the Great Wall. So no one was using any of the stuff. This is us hiking up. So this is the main entrance, and this is very much like what do you expect it to look like, the landscape here. We're hiking up. Now this is still a part that has been mostly reconstructed, but it isn't it's a accurate reconstruction. And as you walk along the Great Wall, well, I'm reminded of what I've read about the Great Wall many times, which is not only was it a wall, obviously, a defensive barrier, but actually it was one of the only real paved passageways through this whole area. And so the wall, as it would become the possession of different powers, kind of depending on the size of different empires and who had control of it at different points in time, because different places did have different control. Well, if you had control of this wall, you had control of communication along a whole giant border, right? And you also were able to transport things along this, because this is all very mountainous, as you can see, very rugged. As you can see, it goes on a real long time, right? Oh, I should go back one. This woman here, who you'll see in some of the photos, she was our local guide. She was Mongolian. Now, this whole area that we're in, this is an area that on maps it will say Inner Mongolia, and that might be confusing because it borders Mongolia. Inner Mongolia is just literally the part of Mongolia that China took over and still has, right? Like half of what had been Mongolia is inside Chinese territory. And the people are Mongolian, but it's within China. And again, you can see the little fortresses here and there as you go. This is just our tour group. Some of the locals. I've talked to you before about high pressure sales tactics that places will kind of put you through if you go visit, right? I've kind of talked about that some. Mm-hmm. In China, I would say sorry, I had a protein bar before class, which is not a great idea. No, it's the sales tactics of the Chinese meshed very well with our Minnesota sensibility. What I mean by that is, like when people joke about Minnesotans, they will say, you know, a Minnesotan, if they go to a store to buy clothing, for example, right? If anyone bothers them at all, they'll just leave because they don't want to be bothered. But if they have a question and someone isn't immediately there, they will also leave. So Minnesotans are considered kind of fickle shoppers. As we are walking along the wall, there was a number of locals who, at the time, we'd assumed were just tourists, because there's lots of tourism from within the country. But as we were walking, someone would like pull out a water, Be like, oh, you wanted to buy some water? And it's like, oh no, I brought my own water, I'm fine. And as we would go, they would actually help us along the path, and if there were areas that had been kind of destructed, they would show us the path around and how to get back on, and were very helpful. And after we had hiked a really long time, like I said, this was like half a day, they'd be like, oh, do you want a sandwich? We're like, no. Like, really, 50 cents? It's like 50 cents for a sandwich? Well, maybe. Okay. And then a little later on, it's like, okay, you still have that water? Okay, I'll buy the water. And they're like, do you want a tour book about the Great Wall of China? It's like, no. Well, maybe. And eventually, we just kind of like bought all their stuff. But it was a very, very casual, low stress. These are some of the kids that walked with us as well. Like I said, we ended up buying all their stuff. Now, as you go out further and further, this is our group. You can see how hazy it is. This was actually a factor of the pollution. This is before 2008 when they cleaned up a lot. There's still a lot of pollution in China in general, but this area is relatively close to Beijing, which is a pretty major, a place where there's a lot of industry, and so there's a lot of pollution. So the air was pretty thick. This is still actually pretty well built. All right, now we're starting to get out into the areas that are more on the kind of Mongolian side, still within China technically, but areas that are, like I said, were called Inner Mongolia. This is a lizard. That's the only life I saw on the walk. And see, as you could get further and further out, right, you see the wall has become kind of more and more overgrown. And you could see that, like, structurally, it's still very similar to the area that was rebuilt. And then as you get to the end, the wall is really just a whole bunch of kind of crumbling. Not much there, right? Because it's, Mongolia came through here. These walls did not last. But no one ever actually goes out to these areas because it just takes forever. So like I said, this is a local actually helping her through. Because it's actually, I would not recommend this hike because it's quite dangerous. We had to walk off the path a lot.
Oh. Was this like near the end of it?
Yeah, this is getting pretty near the end. This is actually the end. This is actually where we jumped off. So we get a little bit of rural China. This is the switch gears. So this is actually more southern and toward the mountains. Well, you can see it's toward the mountains. And that terraced farming that we've seen lots of places, this is an area that actually had been getting drier through time, and so they no longer harvested rice, because for rice you need standing water for long periods of time. But they still were agricultural, but they had to switch their crops. And I don't know, honestly, if this is long-term climate change or maybe just something that had changed in the region. Little village here. But like I said, this all looks like classic rice terraces, but they didn't have any rice grown. They're growing mostly peppers, actually. I think I got a closer picture here and there. Oh, I don't know if you could see, this was, no, you can't really see. This is a little vehicle that people are carrying. They offered for tourists, if you wanted to pay some extra money, you wouldn't have to walk up and down the mountain. You'd have people carry you. I didn't want people carrying my heavy butt around.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know if you can see them being carried.
I would feel bad.
Yeah. And these are just peppers sitting out to dry. It's a lot less like mass of food that they could grow since they can't grow rice, because if this was all rice, it'd be huge amounts of food. It's smaller amounts, but the peppers, they told me, have a higher price. So they still were able to basically make ends meet. Oh, these are the little things that they're carrying people on.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Are those houses like actual homes, or are those just like?
Well, that's a good question. These are actual homes. These are where farmers actually live. And I talked to them, and I saw them farming while I was there. I don't remember if I took any photos of people farming.
I don't know. Like, wouldn't they feel like kind of like overwhelmed? Like, who the hell are these people? Or like.
Well, actually, you know what? Part of the reason I went here on this tour is this was not a huge tourist destination. And so they don't get a ton of tourists. They get like a dozen a week, you know? So it's not like overwhelming tourist central. These are some of the peppers that are growing. All right. Oh, and we took a bus the rest of the way home, and there was a guy who had a duck on the bus. That's kind of unique. So let's see. We also mentioned that it was the same member who built the Terracotta Warriors. I went here as well, but I'm not going to bore you with a bunch of those photos because they all kind of look similar. Interestingly, though, this was the end of his reign because, well, the peasants who were forced into labor to make all these terracotta warriors, they felt it was a bit of a waste of their time and effort to make a whole bunch of guardians for someone who was going to be dead and to guard them in their grave and to be buried. And so there's a big rebellion, but these terracotta warriors are still in place over there. There are a couple of figurines that were from the same time period. This is symbolically crushing enemies. Dragons, a lot of dragon stuff. Thought those would be a little bit more interesting than the terracotta warrior pictures. We're doing good on time. All right. So this chapter jumps around by topic quite a bit. A lot of the other chapters kind of go through time. They start historically and they kind of slowly move up. This chapter really likes to jump around. Talks about the Three Gorges Dam, which is kind of like a big topic when you're looking at China, because it's the biggest dam in the world, right? And we've talked a lot about the pros and cons of dams. Are they worth it? Are they not? Again, this is an area where rivers move around a lot, and so there is a lot of reasons why they wanted to build this project. One of them, since it's the biggest in the world, they really wanted to do it as a sense of national identity of like, hey, look, we made the biggest this in the world. A lot of countries try to do similar things like that. They all want the tallest building. They all want the biggest this or the biggest that. Of course, it creates a reservoir for water for if you ever need it, if there's ever less water. And like I said, that one place I went to, their farming techniques had to change because they have less water in general in that area. Not saying that the country in general has less water. But there are areas that are dry and that are desert, but the soils are decent, and so if they have more water for those, they can actually increase their crop areas. Now because it's the biggest dam in the world, it displaced a lot of people. More than 1 million people had to find new homes. There's also a lot of species that live in the river that would not be able to freely move up and down the river anymore if it was dammed off. But the other side of the coin, if China's looking to create more clean power, right? They had a big pollution problem that they've been working on some. Well, this is clean energy, right? It's not going to pollute your air, right? It gives you more irrigation, controls flooding, controls the likelihood that stream is going to have to jump and go elsewhere and kind of create chaos. So these are just pictures from the book showing you before and after, right? The area when it displaced people. There used to be people who lived all along the river, right? As is many rivers around the world. And so when you put up a dam and it floods out, all those people have to find new homes. There's also a lot of sediment that the river carries, and you could obviously tell that from the color here. And the reason it's that orange color is that lowest deposits, that's an orange kind of colored soil. But since it's carrying all of this, like I said, this is part of the reason why it could kind of plug itself up, right? It could drop off this stuff and have to jump where it goes. All right, climate in this area. When it says a maritime climate, what that means is maritime meaning most of the population of China living along the coasts, places that are near large bodies of water tend to have less extremes of temperature throughout the year and even throughout the day, right? You could go to lots of places, well, Minnesota is a good example where we have pretty extreme temperature changes. It gets very cold and very warm because we're not really by an ocean, right? Oceans ease out those huge ups and downs of temperatures. One of the other things about this area, those deserts that I showed to you, we've talked about a rain shadow effect before. Rain shadow being while those mountains are blocking the water, right? And so you could have a lot of precipitation just on the other side of the mountain in India, right? When we talked about the monsoons, but then just on the other side, you get hardly any. Climate map. Another term this chapter uses, orographic precipitation. I don't think it necessarily says what that is. Orographic precipitation just means you have an air mass that is pushed up, and so then it rains, right? And so you have an air mass, let's say coming from here, right? Plenty of moisture in it. It's pushed up by these mountains, and so that makes it rain. And so then when the air gets over here, it doesn't have any moisture in it anymore. That's why that word is used. When you're looking at this climate map, well, let's see what I could point out that is of note. When people talk about Tibet, Tibet itself is a large area, but has a very small actual population. Well, a map like this makes it look pretty bleak, right? It makes it look like it's tundra, and it mostly is, but there's lots of microclimates. So there'll be lots of little areas along this river, right? Microclimates in this context mean you have mountains, and within the mountains there's all kinds of little nooks and crannies that can have very different climates depending on which way the wind comes from. And so you could have little areas here or there that get a perfect amount of wind that has some amount of moisture in it, so you get some amount of rain. It really depends, right? A big broad map like this doesn't show a lot of those little specifics. But what I showed you of the mountains that had those farms, that was an example of a microclimate. That was over here-ish. Because that was a little area that had actually really great climate for agriculture. Also talked about this in the last chapter about how, well, the reason these mountains are here is because you have this big land mass that is being shoved underneath it, basically, right? As it's smashing into here, it's pushing all this up. In a nutshell. Some more physical geography of the region. We already talked about this being the ring of fire, right? And so this being China, this being Korea, this is Japan here. As you can see, Japan has a major fault line. It actually has a couple connected to it. So this is an area that's going to have a lot of tectonic activity going on. You may notice how extra deep this is. It's because it's a subduction zone. Subduction zone, plates can come together in all kinds of different ways. Sometimes they move side by side. Sometimes they are, well, when they come together, one is forced under. When land masses come together, it's the lighter one that stays on top, and the heavier one goes underneath. But that pressure of it coming underneath, that creates volcanoes and whatnot. And this kind of explains a lot of the landforms in the area. If you look at this is basically like a model of what Japan is, right? Japan is a whole bunch of, well, it has a real deep area right here, right next to it, right? And it has a whole bunch of volcanoes. Japan has been hit by lots of earthquakes through time. And usually you actually won't see it in the news that much when they have big earthquakes because they have lots of rules about the infrastructure to make it earthquake resistant. And so actually they'll have relatively large earthquakes, but will have very little damage, very little casualties. The 2011 earthquake was a bit of a standout one, mostly because, well, it was really close to a bunch of nuclear power plants. And those nuclear power plants, well, they went into meltdown. A lot of radioactive debris was released. Japan gets a fair amount of its energy from nuclear power, which sounds like a bad idea. It's like you have a place that has lots of earthquakes and is on top of volcanoes, and you want to use nuclear power. But nuclear power is a relatively cheap form of power that is also relatively clean as far as air pollution. Until stuff like this happens, anyway. So in the debris of the earthquake, you had mudslides, you had a small tsunami that came in, and what this did was, well, it basically took the radioactive debris and kind of mixed it around with everything else. And then a lot of it just went into the ocean, and a lot of this debris, some of it washed up on the California coast, and it took years of just floating around radioactive debris that would just kind of show up here or there. So that's why that earthquake is of note in this historical time period. All right, moving on to more of the human geography in this area, languages of East Asia. The languages are pretty interrelated, including you could have lots of local dialects that the way they're spoken have changed through time as places have kind of moved apart. But the actual written form is close enough that people can still understand each other if they're looking at the written form. Buddhism, main early influence in this whole region. We talked about it a bit before. Lots of historic monuments and whatnot about Buddha. Especially, you probably have seen these ones where they're in caves, because that's a local Buddhist tradition. Stories of Buddha and the teaching of early Buddha happening in caves. And I think, in this example, I think I showed you a video that we showed, the Taliban basically destroying a lot of these. Again, that's one of those things where if an empire or a people take over a place, they'll often want to destroy evidence of the identities that were before them, you know? And when the Taliban took over and did this the first time, there was great historical outreach, and people were like, "Oh no, these are humanity's legacy." And I believe that there are a number of archaeologists who offered to move these, which is not impossible. You can see people here to give you a size of the scale of these things, right? Little people. But the Taliban at the time, when it was offered that they could be moved, they said, "Oh, don't bother, we're just going to blow them up." And they did. They blew up, I believe, most of them. I don't know if there's any more for them to blow up now that they've taken over again. I guess we'll find out. Oh, all right. I've run out of time for